2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to amendment number 713, offered by the senator from Vermont, Mr. Leahy. The Senate will be in order. Senators on both sides deserve to be heard. Please take conversations off the floor. Senior Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Mr. President, Senator Collins and I, as well as other senators in both parties, worked with law enforcement, worked with the NRA, worked with a whole lot of others to craft this. It gives law enforcement officials the tools they need to stop the all-too-common practices of straw purchasing and illegal trafficking of firearms. This gives us the tools to go after drug cartels that use straw purchasers to get their guns, gangs in big cities who use straw purchasers to get their guns. It's an important law enforcement measure. Across the political spectrum, law enforcement supports it. Let's stand with law enforcement and vote aye.
So the Senate will be in order. Please take conversations off the floor. Senator from Vermont.
And I move to reconsider the last vote. Lay it on the table.
Without objection. So ordered. Senator's time has expired.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas is recognized.
I rise to speak against this amendment. It is worthwhile to strengthen the protections against straw purchasing and trafficking, but unfortunately this language, in my judgment, is overbroad and in particular has a real risk of criminalizing innocent conduct. For example, if your father asks you to purchase a firearm for him and your father pays you, under this bill, both you and your father become felons because it bans any purchase for another person if that individual pays for it. In my judgment, that is overbroad, and that is the reason why in the prior amendment we changed the language to target bad actors and to exclude innocent conduct, to avoid ensnaring those law-abiding citizens with no ill will and to inadvertently make law-abiding gun owners into felons. And so I would urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? Is there a sufficient second? Okay, there appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. K9.
No.
Better. Blumenthal. Sanders. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Pickett. Heinrich. Shaheen. Read. Fallen eye. Read eye. I know. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Hagan, aye. Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand. Right there. Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Mr. Rono, Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden,
I'm here. I'm on top of
Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Beckich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Cowan, Donnelly, Feinstein, Franken, Hagan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. No. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Burr, Chambliss, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoban, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Portman? No. Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Bozeman? No. Mr. Durbin? Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Harkin? Mr. Harkin? Aye. Mr. Lautenberg? Aye. Mr. Paul? No. Right. Ms. Ayotte, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Coates, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 58, the nays are 42. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. Under the previous order, there are now 2